Yes, well, hello again for this sixth and last session of our webinar, Theosophy Raw and Unfiltered, from the Vedas to the Present. This is the home run, and also in some ways what I've been leading up to. First of all, just a little bit of a recap, beginning with that oft-promised chronology slide. Now this is just a chronology slide taking into account what I believe is our real tradition in the Theosophical Society, but also a chronology slide which deals with the subjects that have been presented in this webinar. So it's not a complete chronology or a complete family tree, but we begin with the Rig Veda, which is the first expression of Theosophy, the ancient wisdom or the Aryan philosophy on earth. The Kali Yuga is a very interesting ancestor, the death of Krishna. The Kali Yuga traditionally is timed to coincide with the day after the death of Krishna, 3102 BC. The Upanishads are at the end of the Vedas, and there's various dates. It's very difficult to date the Rig Veda, and it is very difficult to date the Upanishads. Various sources have it from the 9th to the 5th century BC. Subhash Kak, who is I think a very reliable source, has dated tentatively the Upanishads to 1900 or 1000 BC. The Gita you will see down there is dated variously, but basically the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, was recorded at the end of the Upanishadic period and is in fact a summary of the Upanishads. The Buddha, 480 BC. Plato, 428 BC. We include Plato because the eclectic theosophical system, which is the first expression of theosophy by that name, is basically a mixture of Plato and the Upanishads. It's like Vedas and Plato combined. Patanjali, 4th to 2nd BC, and we can see in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras the same clear, strong, steady stream of teaching and influence all the way back to the Rig Veda, through the Upanishads, and then into the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, which are really like a kind of the applied science of the Vedas, the applied science of theosophy in a way in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Then in our present era, Ammonius Saccas, the founder of the eclectic theosophical system, Shankaracharya, the great interpreter of Advaita Vedanta, the teachings in the Upanishads, H.P. Blavatsky and her teachers, but I've just included H.P. Blavatsky here, passing away in 1891, not long before the birth of J. Krishnamurti in 1895. Now, I've included Krishnji here for a couple of reasons. First, in the first or second of this webinar series, I showed that his first work, At the Feet of the Master, is absolutely word for word a restatement of Shankaracharya's teachings. So there is that connection. And also, having listened to Krishnji for a number of years, having seen his talks and really had a tremendous connection with his teachings, I can see throughout that they are absolutely a restatement of the Upanishads. Now, he always denied restating anything, and I'm not suggesting that he restated by reading those texts and then restating them, but he speaks of the same teachings. If the planetary spirit gave the teachings to the rishis that were recorded in the Rig Veda, I think one way or another the same spirit gave the teachings to Krishnji, which is in our own lifetime. Now, HPB also referred to an unbroken succession. And she said in one of her essays, what I do believe in is the unbroken oral teachings revealed by living divine men during the infancy of mankind. So the infancy of mankind, perhaps the Vedic period or even earlier, the unbroken oral teachings revealed by living divine men during the infancy of mankind to the elect among men, the rishis, that it has reached us unaltered. That's why she calls it, I've called it an unbroken succession. The teachings reached her unaltered, and I really would like to see a situation where we pass on those teachings equally unaltered, if at all possible, and that the masters are thoroughly versed in the science based on such uninterrupted teaching. And one of the sciences based on this uninterrupted teaching you will find in the applied science of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Now, one of the reasons for my presenting this webinar and the sort of not so hidden agenda behind the present session is that I really would like to see a situation where a number of us in the Theosophical Society take rather more seriously than seems to be the case, passing on the teachings unaltered. And it's not possible to pass on the teachings unaltered if we don't specify to ourselves and to others what those teachings are. And so in the beginning of this webinar series, I suggested that we have a real problem in the Theosophical Society of a lack of definition, a lack of delineating our subject area. And I will show in a few minutes what is to be gained by doing that, the extraordinary payoff to be gained by doing that. So an unbroken succession, an unbroken set of oral teachings which have come down to us through the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, the works of H.P. Blavatsky, the work of J. Krishnamurti, and I don't deny I haven't included, Annie Besant, Radha Bernier, Sri Ram, and various other people who I think spoke authentically from this tradition based on their own learning and understanding. But those that I have mentioned in that chronology slide are more like primary sources. HPB was, and her teachers were like a primary source. And I think Christianji is a primary source, whereas some of the others are students of those primary sources. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a lot to teach us and a lot to add to the tradition. So we might recall earlier in a previous session, and I'm not going to take any time up with this, HPB pointed out that the one only inflexible rule, the one only way of self-realization or of imbibing the esoteric doctrine, the one inflexible rule, always binding on the neophyte, then as it is now, the complete subjugation of the lower nature by the higher. And here what is meant, in order to understand this from an Aryan philosophy point of view, we really need to understand the nature of the self, our real self, your real self, which is not of the external world, the sensory world, the world of mithya, the falsity of the world, the real self which is eternal and non-sensory and which must be located by each and every one of us. And it's not so much a subjugation of the lower nature as it is a takeover by the higher nature, a realization of the higher nature. And then only is the lower nature subjugated. It's not really the best word there, I think, subjugation, because it implies a kind of a control which is really always of the lower mind, not the higher mind. But again here, just to recap, She had said, from the Vedas and the Upanishads to the recently published Light on the Path, through the Bibles of every race and cult, we find but one only way, hard, painful, troublesome, by which man can gain the true spiritual insight. And in a few minutes, we're going to look a lot more closely at what is the way by which we can gain true spiritual insight according to these teachings. And she said, how can it be otherwise that there is only one way through all of these varied traditions or varied aspects of the one tradition, since all religions and all philosophies are but the variants of the first teachings of the one wisdom imparted to men at the beginning of the cycle by the planetary spirit. And I spent a little time in the last session rather ineptly trying to explain a little bit about the theory of cosmic cycles, and I've just summarized the relevant points in this slide. The question is often asked, why are the ages running down? So the yugas, we start with the golden age and then things run down, things appear to devolve till we get to the present Kali Yuga. If we began knowing more of the truth, carrying the Dharma in its entirety, as it is said we did in the golden age, then how or why did we lose that? We start off being relatively perfect and then we become more and more sullied. Why did we fall from grace? And curiously, almost every ancient civilization has had some notion of a golden age in its distant past. The Confucian, the Australian Aboriginal, probably every ancient civilization had some notion of a golden age in its distant past. And this pattern seems also to conform to the entropy law in physics, or it's mirrored in the entropy law in physics. Or maybe the entropy law in physics is a kind of a physical explanation for the same process, that the universe also is running down. Disorder increases over time. This is an absolutely natural thing, that disorder increases over time. If you don't want disorder to increase over time, you have to do a lot of maintenance. According to the second law of thermodynamics, the universe was in a state of high order at one end of time, the end that we call the past. And from the moment of the birth of the universe in the Big Bang, the universe has been expanding and disorder has been increasing. Stephen Hawking points out that the disorder of physics is nothing other than movement itself. This is quite relevant to esoteric philosophy. The disorder of physics is nothing other than movement itself. Same in esoteric philosophy, the disorder is movement. Where there is movement, there is disorder. Where there is movement in time, there is disorder. Movement in time is paired as an opposite to not moving in eternity. The eternal self does not move. The eternal self does not move. The world of movement, the falsity of the world, is a projection out of that unmoving eternal self. And the projection veils the unmoving eternal self. Hawking points out that in order to survive, human beings, for example, have to consume food, which is an ordered form of energy, and convert it into heat, which is a disordered form of energy. So it's an energy exchange. All movement, all life, all existence in this closed system that we inhabit, the falsity of the world, it's a closed system, and there's only a limited amount of energy in it, and everything is a conversion of energy, and therefore actually a lack of energy, or a reduction in energy in a way. Disorder, increasing disorder. Disorder increases over time. Now, we had a chronology chart which was a kind of a picture of our family tree, and this is another picture of our family tree. looked at from the point of view of just one aspect of one teaching, one of the most important teachings for us as human beings. In, I think it was 1888, H.P. Blavatsky expressed that teaching in the third fundamental proposition of the Secret Doctrine, where she notes the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul. About 1600 years prior to that, the eclectic theosophical system in ancient Greece had the self-same teaching in these words: belief in the human being's immortal nature, identical in essence with the universal soul. A couple of thousands of years before then, in the Upanishads and in the Vedas, we have the same teaching very succinctly put in one of the great sayings of Vedanta, Aham Brahman, I am Brahman, the identity of the immortal part of the human being with the eternal, the intelligence of the universe, the real self of the human being, the real self of the embodied individual is the same as the innermost essence of the universe, which we call Brahman. Brahman is just a term for the innermost essence of the universe, just as Atma or the Atman is a term for the innermost essence of the human being. So this is our family tree. We have these teachings sent to us or given to us through three totally different epochs separated by vast periods of time, the self-same teaching about the nature of the self. Now I would like to start to show how relevant this tradition is to our work in the Theosophical Society, and also to say a little more about our work in the Theosophical Society with reference to these teachings. Now, we're all very familiar with the objects of the Society, but this is how they were in 1890, as expressed by one of our founders, H.P. Blavatsky. Very similar to what they are now, but not the same. And H.P. Blavatsky's take on these objects is similar to what most of us would hold today, but not the same. And there are some very enlightening differences. So the objects in 1890 to form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste or colour, to promote the study of Aryan and other Eastern literatures, religions, philosophies and sciences. And a third object, pursued by a portion of the Fellows of the Society, is to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the psychic powers of man. Now but those two, the second and the third object, have undergone a series of important revisions. We now know that the second object now is the study to promote the study of comparative religion, philosophy and science. No mention of the study of Aryan and other Eastern religions, philosophies and science. And also a very important change to the third object, which H.P. Blavatsky makes plain here, is pursued by a portion of the Fellows of the Society. On the subject of the first object, HPB says, everyone entering the Society is supposed to sympathize with the theory of essential brotherhood, a kinship which exists on the plane of the higher self, not on that of the racial, social and mental dissimilarities and antipathies. I wonder how many members of the Theosophical Society today, especially the newer members, have realized that the first object, which speaks of the universal brotherhood of humanity, and really of all life, is something that exists. The kinship exists on the plane of the higher self, your real self, not at the level of mithya, the falsity of the world. The falsity of the world is full of racial, social, mental dissimilarities and antipathies. That's what the world is all about. These differences. The unity does not exist in the realm of mithya, the false world. The unity exists only at the realm of Sat, the real, Brahman, Atma, your real self. That is universally diffused throughout all matter and all nature and all living beings. So that's HPB's take on the first object. Everyone entering the society is supposed to sympathize with the theory of essential brotherhood, a kinship or a brotherhood which exists on the plane of the higher self only. We believe the human body to be but the shell, cover or veil of the real entity. It is the physical body only which has racial type, color, sex, hatreds, ambitions and loves. We believe, and she could include Shankaracharya, Plato, Patanjali, her teachers, and the rishis that tied down or recorded the teachings in the Rig Veda, all of us, all of them, we believe the human body to be but the shell, cover or veil of the real entity, your real self, the Atman. It is the physical body only which has racial type, color, sex, hatreds, ambitions and loves. The second object, she says, speaks so plainly for itself that I need not dwell upon it save in the most casual way, and we're not going to dwell upon it either. The founders of the Theosophical Society thought they had the best reason to believe that there existed locked up in the ancient literatures of India, Ceylon, Tibet, China, Japan and other Eastern countries a very large body of truth which would be most important and valuable to the present generation, and most important and valuable to our present generation as well, if it could be got at. And it was to get at it that she and HPB and others put a great deal of time and effort and energy and money into inspiring and cajoling local priests in all of these places to preserve their tradition, to translate, to gather it together. And that was one of the, this is one of the motives behind the creation of the Adyar Lending Library at our international headquarters with its collection of palm leaf manuscripts and other ancient texts, to gather together the locked up ancient literatures of India, Ceylon, Tibet, China, Japan and other Eastern countries. Among the most important, she says, are the Vedas, the Gita, the writings of Shankara, Patanjali and other renowned Aryan philosophers and mystics. The third object, pursued by a portion of the fellows of the society, is to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the psychic powers of man. Now her take on, HPB's take on this object, I think is a very useful one for any office bearers of the Theosophical Society to keep in mind, because so often we get asked rather incredulously by inquirers who come along trying to share and show off their real or assumed psychic powers, and they wonder why some of us are just not interested, why we don't think that is really part of our work in the society, when after all we've got a big sign outside basically saying that we are interested in exploring the unexplained powers of nature, the powers latent in man, and they come along to us with power, latent powers, wanting to exhibit some of these latent powers, and some of us are really not interested. But HPB's take on this is a very, very sound one. Observe the third declaration, that only a portion of our fellows occupy themselves with the study of the occult properties of matter and the psychical powers of man. The society as a whole, then, is not concerned in this branch of research. The society as a whole is not concerned in this branch of research. The chances are that but a very small minority have the time, taste, or ability to take up such delicate and baffling studies. Now, in the remainder of this session of the webinar, I'm going to be restating my case of the importance of delineating our subject matter in the Theosophical Society and getting over our not wanting to be dogmatic. We can delineate the subject matter of Theosophy in the Theosophical Society without being the least bit dogmatic about it, but still laying out before everyone for all to see and for all to study what those teachings in fact are, not according to my opinion or your opinion, but the actual history of the teachings dating back to the Vedic period. There was a quote that I shared from a lecture that Sri Ram, the 5th International President of the Theosophical Society, gave to the National Convention of the Australian section in the early 1970s. A person can find out what Theosophy is, partly from the thoughts and writings which have come down from ancient times, partly by studying the modern theosophical works of H.P. Blavatsky, Annie Besant and others, and partly by his or her own earnest meditations and inquiry. And I will show in a few minutes that the quote here from Sri Ram is a very useful summary, not only of what we should be presenting in the Theosophical Society as Theosophy, but also how to go about it. We will see in a moment that it of necessity involves, first of all, hearing the teachings, then our own earnest inquiries into the teachings, and then our meditations on the teachings. This is a slide from the previous session. The importance of delineating a subject matter should not be underestimated. The quote here is from a 5th century linguistics textbook by the name of Vakyapadya. Vak means the word. It also means meaning and speech, Vak. Vakyapadya, the linguistics textbook, Bhritrahari's linguistic textbook, 5th century CE, in which it is said, "In this world there can be no knowledge without an object to be known. In this world there can be no knowledge without an object to be known." And in Vedanta and in our tradition of Theosophy, the word knowledge is often capitalized because it means much more than just intellectual knowledge. And indeed, in this text, the word knowledge means much more than just the common sense understanding of knowledge. This knowledge also means realization. In this world, there can be no knowledge leading to self-realization without an object to be known. Without clearly defining your subject matter, you cannot even begin on the path. The statement below there, without distinguishing the proper object of knowledge from all the background noise, we cannot even begin. My camera keeps freezing. Without distinguishing the proper object of knowledge from all the background noise, we cannot even begin. That's really my statement to those who, my point to those who create the programs of lectures and other activities in the Theosophical Society, many of which could give the impression to newcomers coming along to the Theosophical Society that Theosophy is nothing really specific, that Theosophy is everything. But Theosophy is not everything. Theosophy is quite a well-defined tradition going back to the Rig Veda, then through classical Greece, and all the way to the writings of H.P. Blavatsky and beyond. There is a clearly definable tradition of Theosophy, and clearly discernible definitions of theosophy. And many of our programs have anything and everything on them, sometimes very little classical theosophy or real theosophy in any of the three aspects of Sri Ram, either the ancient teachings, the writings of HPB, or our own earnest meditations and inquiry on the subject. So there's all kinds of things on our program. And without distinguishing the proper object of knowledge from that background noise, we're not going to be able to really begin our real work in the Theosophical Society, which we will look at in a moment. The linguistics textbook, Vakyapadiya, when I started reading excerpts from that, and on one of the slides, upcoming slides, you'll see where you can get a link to the excerpts from the linguistics textbook, Vakyapadiya, I was really surprised that this linguistics textbook suddenly starts talking about the nature of reality and Brahman. And I found later on, reading around about the same time, one of the essays of Subhash Kak, I think it was his talk on science in ancient India. He pointed out some of the traditional pairings in ancient India, pairings of knowledge. And the traditional pairings were logic and physics, cosmology or Sankhya and yoga, and language and reality. Language and reality, the study of language, Mimamsa, and linguistics, and reality or Vedanta are paired in ancient India. So it's not surprising that in the linguistics textbook we find a lot of teachings about not just how meaning is created and what constitutes a meaningful statement, but also the meaning of life, of ultimate reality. Now, in the linguistics textbook, and the next 2 or 3 slides begin quite a radical program for our work in the Theosophical Society, but one that is absolutely grounded in its tradition. So it says, where formal logic blindly follows words expressed in outward speech, it's just a verbal mimicking that ties no concrete meaning down. Where formal logic or a treatise or an expression of a teaching or a lecture blindly follows words expressed in outward speech, it's just a verbal mimicking that ties no concrete meaning down. It cannot record anything. To record a teaching is to tie it down in a text. It's not recorded, however, if it's just verbal mimicking. Such logic is not found in texts of genuine authority. Texts of genuine authority are not formal logic blindly following words expressed in outward speech. Texts of genuine authority, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Secret Doctrine, the Mahatma Letters, the Gita, the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, everybody in our chronology slide at the beginning of this session, texts of genuine authority are not just verbal mimicking. We will see in a moment what they are if they are not just verbal mimicking. We will see in a moment what it means to not just verbally mimic or intellectually mimic, but to really know and therefore to really teach. Linguistics is a discipline whose aim is knowledge, clarified from errors of mistaken use. Linguistics is a discipline whose aim is knowledge, clarified from errors of mistaken use. And that is something that would be very useful for us to do in the Theosophical Society with the subject of theosophy, clarifying it from errors of mistaken use, should they arise. It is recorded through an uncut continuity of learning that is called to mind by those who've learned it well and handed down. The teaching is recorded through an uncut continuity of learning, and HPB did say that the teachings had reached her in an unbroken succession, an uncut continuity of learning, by those who've learned it well and hand it down. From each generation to the next, this is still the Vakyapadiya, from each generation to the next, the intent remembered is reconstituted over and over again in an unbroken succession, in an established tradition of common practice that has not been recorded in words. Only the unbroken practice of those who succeed in learning is remembered. This is one of the most profound two sentences that I have read, and I think of extreme significance to our work in the Theosophical Society, of great significance. From each generation to the next, the intent remembered, the teaching remembered, and remember means to put together again. You dismember and then you remember. So the teaching remembered is reconstituted over and over again in an unbroken succession, in an established tradition of common practice that has not been recorded in words. It is recorded in the unbroken practice, the unbroken understanding of those who succeed in learning. That is how it is recorded. Material records, which is what we've got in all of our libraries in the Theosophical Society, are drop-dead fantastic libraries. Material records are inherently dead and decaying. They come to life only when their meaning is interpreted afresh by living speakers on the basis of a living energy whose functioning grounds words in lasting knowledge. Material records are inherently dead, so theosophy is inherently dead and decaying. It comes to life only when its meaning is interpreted afresh by living speakers on the basis of a living energy whose functioning grounds words in lasting knowledge. Pretty amazing? I think so. Going to skip that slide. Now, the teaching and the living knowledge, the wisdom, the ancient wisdom, the Aryan philosophy. The subject matter par excellence is the nature of the self, your real self, and the real self of the universe, the creation, Brahman. This beautiful quote from the Mundaka Upanishad is not only beautiful, but absolutely accurate. Brahman is not grasped by the senses, as it is subtle and infinite, but is realized by the intellect, purified through knowledge and meditation. Brahman, the real, even what is. The real is not grasped by the senses, as it is subtle and infinite, but is realized by the intellect, purified through knowledge and meditation. Our intellects, our minds, are purified by knowledge and meditation, and only then can we see clearly, and only then can we clearly see the self. There is a very useful, there's a number of very useful triplicities in Vedanta that we could well do with taking on board in our work in the Theosophical Society. And one of them is this full spectrum of learning. This is what is involved in learning a tradition in Vedanta. Let's just skip ahead now to the one of those very useful triplicities in Vedanta that we could well do with taking on board in the Theosophical Society if we really want to teach what it means to learn Theosophy. So this is Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. The first stage in learning anything, and in fact the first stage in self-realization, is hearing about the teachings, listening. So first of all, we learn what has been said about the subject from teachers and other primary sources, such as the Upanishads. In this stage, we listen with faith. We listen without judgment. We have to listen and hear a teaching before being able to evaluate it. So often in lectures and in daily life, we jump to conclusions. We think that we've understood something when a teaching has only even been partly expressed, or we start to make judgments about a teaching well before we've actually heard the whole teaching. Questions start to arise. We need to set those questions aside at first and just listen to the teaching and learn about it from reliable teachers and other primary sources such as the Upanishads, the Yoga Sutras, the Vedas, the Secret Doctrine, the Mahatma letters, what have you. So in this stage of hearing, we're just listening. We're listening with a kind of faith in some sense, with the confidence that these teachings are genuine, shruti, as they come from a state of self-realization or real learning, real knowledge. So in the case of the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, Plato's works, these teachings did come to us from a state of self-realization. So these teachings were given to real rishis, real seers. And the Secret Doctrine also is a genuine source, I believe. But the first stage of learning is shravana, hearing. Then, most importantly, there is reflection. The word manana means careful and considered reflection. This is the critical inquiry stage, which is also essential to understanding. First of all, we listen to the teachings, and then we start to think about them. We start to add real knowledge to that initial faith by doubting, questioning, going through a process of studying, logical processes which remove doubts. And we face questions that arise as we have been listening, and we clarify things. That's the stage of reflection. But finally, there is a stage of contemplation, nididhyasana. This is where we get to understanding itself. We can't get to understanding itself without, or real understanding or real knowledge, without first hearing the teachings, giving them an honest and fair hearing, a thorough hearing, then reflecting on them with critical inquiry. But then this gets dropped when we actually sit face to face and contemplate those teachings. Contemplation or meditation on the teachings is where you just hold yourself steadily in front of the teaching, without moving away, without thinking, just undivided attention on the subject itself. This technique, incidentally, also works a treat when coming to terms with a broken heart or sorrow or anything that you're deeply upset about, rather than judging it or trying to do anything about it at all, because the one trying to do something about it is the one who actually got herself in that mess in the first place. What really works a treat is just sitting next to it or standing in front of it and giving it bare attention without moving away. Now this shravana, manana, nididhyasana, what is one of the things that are quite interesting about this triplicity is that it can be paired with the three states of consciousness: the waking state, when we are hearing the teachings; the dream state, which is a state of reflection; and nididhyasana, contemplation, which is equivalent to deep dreamless sleep. Now in the waking state is defined as the state you are in when you are receiving sensory impressions from the external world. That is the state in which we are reading or hearing the teachings. The dream state, sushupti, is equivalent to this state of reflection, because in the dream state we are not acting on sensory impressions that we're receiving from the outside world. We are repeating sensory impressions that we received from the outside world earlier in the day or in some other life. So same here, we're not in the state of reflection, we're no longer listening to the teachings or reading the teachings, but in our own mind we are going to work on them. And then the third state in which our consciousness exists, deep dreamless sleep, there is no activity of thought at all. That is the equivalent of this state of nididhyasana, where we are contemplating the teachings, not thinking about them anymore, just looking at them. That's a state of watchfulness. And underneath that, I could have put a fourth line, which represents pure contentless consciousness, the fourth state, or turiya. Another triplicity in Vedanta, which is important to our work in the Theosophical Society, if we want to take seriously the injunction to show the world that such a thing as theosophy exists, then we need to learn about it, we need to learn what it is, and then we need to show it to others. Is this seen, seeing, and seer slide? All knowledge begins first of all with an object to be known, hence the importance of delineating our subject matter. All knowledge begins first of all with an object to be known, and then we start to go to work on that object after we've looked at it or listened to it through a process of knowing, a succession of knowing states. So we start to think about it, we raise doubts about it, we clarify. The end result there, through that process of knowing, having first listened to the teachings, we come to knowledge. So we come to knowledge itself. It might be knowledge of theosophy or knowledge of whatever it is was the object of knowledge to begin with. We also come at the same time to a state of objectless consciousness. In that state of meditation, we start off with an object to be meditated upon. But in that state of meditation, we eventually come to a state of objectless consciousness. There is no meditation when there is an object. There is no meditation when there is the observer and the observed. So meditation or knowledge itself always results in the individual coming to that state of pure contentless consciousness. So moving a little further in the slide, we begin with objects differentiated in external space. We begin with a teaching about theosophy that has come down to us through the ages. Then we go to work on that teaching with our own mind, nothing but our own mind and our own intelligence. We wrestle with that teaching, we think about that teaching, we gain our own real knowledge of that teaching. But to gain real knowledge of that teaching, you have to set aside the thinking process altogether eventually and contemplate that teaching. So you start off with a subject differentiated from all the background noise of all the other subjects in the world, differentiated in external space. And through this subtle process, you eventually come to a state in which there is nothing undifferentiated in external space. My top light has just gone off, that's interesting. So we start off with objects differentiated in external space, and through meditation we eventually come to the seer. We start off with the seen, some subject that we are looking at in external space. We go through a process of really educating ourselves about that subject. And eventually we transcend knowledge itself. We get to knowledge itself, which is actually at one with the seer. So in the Theosophical Society, If we present Theosophy correctly, according to its tradition, its real tradition, which was not made up by me and it was not made up by you, but it really exists in the world, a real, discernible, definable tradition of Theosophy. And if we include in our presentations the various ways in that tradition of learning Theosophy, then I think we start to get together a really excellent package of what our work in the Theosophical Society could be. We saw in one of the earlier sessions that HPB had selected this excellent quote from the Zohar: "The narratives of the doctrine," that is the text of the teaching, the words, the narratives of the doctrine, "are just its outer cloak. The simple look only at the garment, that is, upon the narrative. More they know not. The instructed, however, see not merely the cloak, but what the cloak covers." If we want to see not merely the cloak, which we see initially through hearing the teachings, if we want to see what the cloak covers, we need to go through that initial intellectual process of honing our knowledge, and then we need to contemplate the teachings. In that stage of contemplating the teachings, we actually contact the teachings themselves beyond the words, and as a result, we, the student, are absolutely transformed. I do like to pair up some of these ancient Vedantic takes on learning and reading with more modern treatments of a similar subject or related subject. I recently came across an excellent book called How to Read a Book. You know, I've read lots of books, and it might seem like, a bit too late for me to learn how to read a book, but I found that one quite compelling. And in that book, there are a couple of statements that are relevant to this webinar. Reading for the purpose of enlightenment or education is not a passive exercise. It's not like receiving a blow to the head or a legacy. This is Adler and Van Doren. Reading for the purpose of enlightenment is not a passive exercise. It's not like receiving a blow to the head or a legacy. The active reader is more like the catcher in a baseball game, in which the pitcher or batter is the sender and the catcher is the receiver. But both the sender and the receiver in a baseball game play an active role. So often our reading is very passive. We're just sort of sitting there letting the words come in more or less, but we're not actively catching them. The art of reading is the skill of catching every sort of communication as well as possible. Learning from a book instead of a living teacher entails going to work on the book without an external guide, with nothing but the power of your own mind to work on the symbols before you, the text, to the extent that you gradually reach a state of understanding more. So we begin in a state of understanding less or nothing about a teaching, but by going to work on that teaching with our own minds and no external guide, to work on the symbols before us, we eventually get to a state in which we understand more. This is exactly what we find in the Shravana Manana Nididhyasana. First of all, we hear the teachings, then we go to work on them in a state of reflection with the use only of our own mind, and eventually we come to a state of understanding more. Now this is I'm going to skip this. In an earlier session, I raised the question, what kind of a place is this meant to be? What kind of a place is the Theosophical Society? And there was a quote from Sri Ram giving a little bit of background knowledge to the motto of the Theosophical Society, Satya Nasti Paro Dharma, there is no religion or dharma higher than truth. And Sri Ram said there is no dharma, no doctrine, no given rule of conduct, nothing that we may rely upon for support higher than truth. The society stands for that truth and brotherhood. So there is nothing in the Theosophical Society that we may rely upon for support that is higher than truth. The word truth here was translated from the Sanskrit sat, one of the three categories of existence. Sat, or truth, is a term for the eternal, for the real, the only really real. There is the world of passing forms, which is not real in that sense, and there is the eternal Sat. Sat is a term for the eternal, the reality underlying the world of things and lives and minds. It is not truth as the word is used in common speech, and there is a lot of misunderstanding among people who take the word truth in our motto as in some like giant correct fact or something like that. Rather, it is a technical term for the non-sensory reality, Sat, Chit, Ananda. The word truth in our motto, Sat, is a technical term for the non-sensory reality that is also called Sat, Chit, Ananda, eternal existence, intelligence, and bliss. So what kind of a place is the Theosophical Society meant to be? A place which is the home of this teaching. What kind of a place is this meant to be? Well, here's a few ways of describing what kind of a place is this meant to be. It's a place where people find out what Theosophy is by a combination of the three ways mentioned by Sri Ram, hearing the teachings from the ancients, or reading, understanding, or learning about theosophy from the ancient teachings, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the works of Plato, the eclectic theosophical system, the Patanjali Yoga Sutras and other direct original sources, and also our own earnest meditations and inquiry, and of course the writings of H.P. Blavatsky and others in the Theosophical Society. So these are three ways of finding out what Theosophy is, and three ways of presenting Theosophy to people coming along to the TS, thus adequately outlining the subject area for ourselves and others. And without adequately outlining the subject area, there is nothing authentic, there is nothing genuine, there is nothing true, nothing stable, nothing solid for our own intellects to go to work on. Then also, what kind of a place is this? This is a place where we learn about Theosophy by that tripartite method of hearing the original teachings, critical inquiry, and contemplation. What kind of a place is this meant to be? As we all know, the Theosophical Society is a place of study, meditation, and service. But with study being on Theosophy as outlined above. And what kind of a place is this meant to be? This is a place where we promote both yoga, which is all about self-realization, and also the preparatory path, Kriya Yoga. This is a place where we learn about, study and practice preparatory yoga, and also study, learn and practice yoga for those who are ready for that. And we should be promoting both. We should be promoting both. Now this, to close with, is another way of answering the question, what kind of a place is the Theosophical Society meant to be? In this quote from The Key to Theosophy, HPB is speaking about founding schools, but what she says about founding schools is equally absolutely relevant to presenting Theosophy, going about our work in the Theosophical Society, what we should be doing, what kind of a place is this? What does it mean to study Theosophy? This is another way of answering that question. we would found schools which would turn out something else than reading and writing candidates for starvation. Now let's just pause at that sentence. We would found schools which would turn out something else than reading and writing candidates for starvation. Why does she say reading and writing candidates for starvation? She says that because in the world, generally speaking, we learn to read and write, but we don't learn how to really live. We don't learn how to get over the afflictions that beset all human beings, such as sorrow, suffering, the kleshas, ignorance, I amness, attractions and repulsions towards objects, and the instinctive and sometimes quite damaging sense of preservation of life, this instinctive sense of self-preservation, which makes us reading and writing candidates for starvation or disappointment or sorrow or poverty or broken hearts or some other kind of strife. We would reduce the purely mechanical work of the memory to an absolute minimum and devote the time to the development and training of the inner senses, faculties and latent capacities, to educate the child so as to produce the most harmonious and equal unfoldment of its powers. Now going back to the last few slides, we would reduce the purely mechanical work of the memory to an absolute minimum and devote the time to the development and training of the inner senses. We need to promote this very heavily in the Theosophical Society, not so much in terms of the third object of studying the capacities, the latent powers of the human being, but just including in our work, in our teaching, in our lectures, in our practices, a certain degree of training of learning. How do we learn? What does it mean to learn? It means, first of all, hearing the teaching, then critical inquiry, and finally meditation on that teaching, direct perception of that teaching. That is also what is included here. That is also what is implied in the training of the inner senses. The sense of listening, the sense of looking, how to really hear those teachings, which includes not just mental activity, but mental inactivity. So to educate the child so as to produce the most harmonious and equal unfoldment of its powers, in order that its special aptitudes should find their full natural development. We should aim at creating free men and women, free intellectually, free morally, unprejudiced in all respects, and above all things unselfish. And we believe that much, if not all of this, could be obtained by proper and truly theosophical education. Now just looking at that a little bit more closely, we should aim at creating free men and women. Now here she is probably using the words free men and women in the common sense, the common usage of the word free men and women, but she's amplifying free intellectually, free morally, unprejudiced in all respects, and above all things unselfish. I think this applies also, included in this, we must include that we should aim at creating free men and women, free in the Vedanta sense, free in the Theosophical sense, liberated human beings, liberated from thought, liberated from the me, liberated from the falsity of the world, free in that sense as well, not just intellectually free, but actually liberated, moksha. We should aim at creating liberated human beings. And we believe that much, if not all of this, could be obtained by proper and truly theosophical education. Yes, she said, and above all things unselfish. And let us remember, yes, freedom from ignorance, freedom from existential ignorance, avidya. And let us remember what the word unselfish means in Theosophy, in Vedanta, in the Yoga Sutras, and in the writings of the teachers of H.P. Blavatsky. All of us have to get rid of our own ego, the illusory apparent self, to recognize our true self in a transcendental divine life. But if we would not be selfish, we must strive to make other people see that truth, to recognize the reality of that transcendental self. So to be free and unselfish in Theosophy and in Vedanta and in Plato means to be free of the illusory apparent self. It does not mean to be nice, it does not mean to be good, it does not mean to help little old ladies cross the road. It means to be free of the illusory apparent self because you have recognized the true self in a transcendental divine life. To be free here means to be self-realized. So H.P. Blavatsky's scheme for a proper and truly theosophical education, I believe, could well also be included as a part of our scheme for moving forward in the Theosophical Society and really starting to learn and teach Theosophy in this well-established, solid, stable, reliable tradition that has come down to us all the way from possibly 8000 BC, unscathed, an unbroken succession, an untarnished succession. And it's up to us now, moving forward, to pass on the baton equally unbroken, and if we neglect to properly define our subject area in the Theosophical Society, we do in fact drop the ball. Theosophy is not everything. Theosophy is something quite specific, and it made it to the Rig Veda, it made it to the Upanishads, it made it to the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, it made it to HPB, and it made it to Krishnaji. Let's not drop the ball now. And so that's the end of our, that's the end of the preach. That's the end of the missionary statement from down under. This is my vision for our work in the Theosophical Society. And I'm sure that if around the world a number of people here and there started to refocus on things in this way, I'm not saying that nobody is focused on these teachings in this way, but perhaps if we gather together, gather our forces together, a few people here and there around the Theosophical Society, we could start to really put together a package of authentic teachings and authentic methods of learning and authentic methods of teaching that are really in keeping with the aims and ethos of the Theosophical Society as understood by its founders and many of the leading figures in the Theosophical Society right up until today. But it needs work because a lot of our programs give the impression that Theosophy is anything and everything. Not many of our programs focus clearly on these teachings, which are not my opinions about Theosophy, but factual. It's not my opinion that this is Theosophy. It's the opinion of the authors of the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Yoga Sutras, the early founders of the original founders of the Theosophical Society, HPB's teachers, and so forth. This is a solid, dependable, rich, enlivening tradition. And we have the responsibility and the opportunity to learn it and therefore pass it on in an unbroken succession. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for inviting me to present this mini-series. Until we meet again, bye-bye.